Good morning, conference. I can see folks continuing to introduce themselves in the chat, so please do keep doing that. And a huge thank you to Sam and Hilary for that amazing energizer. I was cackling in the background while getting ready to open this morning, and then to Sam for all the etiquette and all of that, really, really necessary intro there. So in just a few seconds, I'm going to start with the opener, but I don't know if we need to kind of switch the screens around. I don't know if folks can see me right now. So I'm just going to give it a minute or so and then we'll kick off again. So yeah, just wanted to say a massive good morning to everyone, and then I'll go for it. Okay, awesome. I'm getting wonderful news in the chat that folks can see me. So all that leaves me to say is good morning, conference. My name is Larissa, my pronouns are she, her, and I have the joy and privilege of being president at the National Union of Students, which means that through local students' unions and through delegates elected to last year's national conference, alongside the wonderful team who you just saw on the video, we're elected to represent the 7 million students across further and higher education in the UK. And what a year it's been to take on these roles. As an officer team, week 6 of our terms was the A-levels fiasco, followed by the chaotic and exploitative return to campus with student lockdowns, and ever since, it's been a year like no other. When I was on my placement a year ago, if you told me how many storms we'd have to weather this year, I probably wouldn't have believed you. And doing it all in the face of a government, a Westminster government, that showed so much disdain for students and for what we're fighting for has not been easy for any of us. But as you heard it in that video just before, through the eye of those storms, we have collectively built campaigns that have not only won time and again for students, from U-turns on grades to millions of pounds in students' pockets and so much more that we intend to win, and I'll get onto that a little bit later. But they're also campaigns that seek to grasp at the roots of injustices that students have been subjected to by the government. And our wins so far prove that through collectivism and solidarity, everything is possible. Too often, and especially in times like these, we're left fighting the weeds of injustice that spring up around us quicker than we can cut them down. And by that, I mean we get stuck dealing with the symptoms of what's rotting under the surface. And under the surface, without even scratching very far, we can see an education system that's been broken for decades. The COVID pandemic didn't cause the problems we're facing. It just magnified them and brought them to light. Where students were lied to about this academic year in order to be exploited for fees and rent, we see the roots of the failed project of marketisation. It shows how inherently flawed it is to run education like a business and to treat students like customers. And we've also seen the colonial roots of our education system exposed, where Black, brown and Muslim students face disproportionate harassment and violence from security and police, and the hostile environment extends from the Home Office to our homes on campus. NUS's long-standing slogan, as I just said in that video over the decades, has been unity is strength. And in saying that, we recognise that our union is only as powerful as the sum of its members. It is our collective voice that is made up of every single one of you here in this virtual room now, and all of the student campaigners and student officers that you organise with locally, that makes us what we are. And that is what gives us the power to fundamentally reckon with not only what we're facing today, but what students have been facing for decades and what they will continue to face unless we act. Often as a student organizer, as a student officer, I've been there. Those systems and structures of the institutions that we're moving in and through, they try to limit what we believe is possible. A year ago, they probably would have tried to tell us that U-turns from this government were impossible. They would have tried to tell us that student rent strikers and student officers coming together to win thousands of pounds back for students was impossible. These institutions, they try to exhaust us with bureaucracy. They befriend us in order to disarm us, all while ultimately continuing to profit from the economic exploitation of students through treating international students like cash cows, through extortionate rents that have left so many at the brink financially, and so much more. And they also continue to benefit from the destruction of communities around the world. You know, universities have massive investments in fossil fuels, in the arms trade, and of course, these disproportionately impact our siblings in the global south. So when education is being run like a business, ultimately, it all comes down to money and PR. And I learned this lesson viscerally during my time as a student organizer and then as an officer. And I'll give a content warning here around sexual violence and racist and anti-Semitic violence for this minute or so of my speech. Because during my time as president of Warwick Anti-Sexism Society, which is essentially our feminist society, there was a horrific scandal. There was a group chat where men at our university felt emboldened to talk about violating women on our campus, harming Black, Brown, and Jewish students on our campus. And, you know, I was in my second year of uni. I was so passionate about changing things, about changing not only the education system, but the world. And I saw my university prioritize their image ahead of student safety, ahead of marginalized student safety. They attempted to reconcile violence because it was easier, because it made sense to them. And you know, I've seen this happen time and time again, in this case from years before, and this year in response to rent strikes and other forms of student resistance to injustice. We see that the marketized university, when university is being run like a business, they consistently see pound signs where they should see people. And when I've been thinking about this, reflecting on this, I keep coming back to one quote that, you know, one of two Black women professors at my university told to me. She said, "You're not an organizer because you're a student. You're an organizer using the resources and tools available to you as a student to re-envision a new education system and a new world, and collectively to move towards it." And I think about that often. I think about that often because the problems that we're facing as students are inherently linked to our lived realities between and beyond our lived realities as students. That's why we've seen students at the helm of Reclaim These Streets marches from London to Leicester, Flintshire to Falkirk, and so many places in between. Students have been resisting gendered violence and police violence. That's why we've been coming together to remember, honour and demand justice, not only for Sarah Everard, but for Blessing Olusegun and Libby Squire too. That's why we've been out there fighting to kill the bill, fighting for students and with students who identify with the GRT community, with student activists, resisting the hostile environment, and seeing that all of this is not only in relation to the UK, because where we see the ban on the hijab in France, seeing the potential that that could extend to higher education, we stand in solidarity with our siblings. Where we see students around the world fighting for justice, we stand in solidarity with them. Because all of us want the same thing. We want a free, liberated education system that actually serves the student, staff, and communities that it should, that it exists to serve. And how do we get there? We get there through political education. Sarah there in the video spoke about how we've poured our resources into political education. And the very reason for that is that we all come to this movement at different stages in our journey. We come here to learn from one another, that reciprocal engagement that means that I'm excited this week to learn from you, and I hope that in some way you will learn from one another. We push one another to be better, to be bolder. And that's why I'm beyond excited to re-announce that we've been working with student organisers across the Red Square movement, which is made up of a number of student-led organisations and the World Transformed, to bring together a political education organising school where you can learn more, and I'll drop the link to that in the chat after this. When we've been building this school, which is really designed to empower folks to be talking about what they've experienced this year, to link it to all of those things at the surface, all of those things at the root, I've been reflecting on this quote from Fred Hampton, who was deputy chairman of the National Black Panther Party. He said, "We're going to have to do more than talk. We're going to have to do more than listen. We're going to have to do more than learn. We're going to have to start practicing, and that's very hard. We're going to have to start getting out there with the people." And I keep coming back to that because I think that's where we're at, right? As a movement, I think this year we've done so much talking, capturing where we're at, which has been so important. We've done so much listening, hearing from students on the front lines, hearing from students who've been directly impacted by, the brunt, bearing the brunt of how this government has treated students. And so much of that has been happening, and I've been so excited to see it. And now it's time to learn. We've got to do that learning to really connect it to the broader issues that we're facing, because there is so much to scratch under the surface. But once we've done the talking, once we've done the listening, once we've done the learning, we've got to start practicing. We've got to start getting out there. We've got to start building that movement. Because I said earlier that our union, is only as powerful as the sum of its members. And as we approach our 100th birthday next year, I'm realizing that we collectively as a movement get to decide what the history books say about this era of the student movement. We get to say, in 30 years, are they looking back and seeing how the virus hit, and because of everything going on, we settled for crumbs? Or are they looking back and writing that we came together in unity, that we shook the table, that we revolutionized education, that we said, keep your crumbs, we're coming after the whole cake. We demand free, demarketized, democratized, decolonized education that is free from cradle to grave, that belongs to the students, staff, and communities it exists to serve. We demand all of it. And all of it is possible, though none of it can be won in isolation. It has to be won through collectivism. And that's why we're coming together tomorrow evening for a digital rally at 6 p.m. in partnership with SUs across the country, from Dudley to Christchurch to Hope and so many more, and in partnership with grassroots student groups like the Rent Strike Movement, Pandemic PGRs, and Pause or Pay, who represent studio-based learners. We're uniting these unions and these student-led groups to make sure that our collective voice is loud enough that the government cannot ignore us. So we need as many of you there as possible to demand that the Westminster government step up to deliver economic justice and academic justice for students. Calling for economic justice, we demand funding to address how hard students have been hit this year. We are seeking a true student support package, upwards of £700 million, to get more money in students' pockets. We demand the restoration of maintenance grants and the EMA, the Education Maintenance Allowance, in line with the student living income, making sure that we address the structural issues that left us here in the first place. And we demand that the government underwrite tuition fees in full, not just this year, but every year, because never again should students be seen as pound signs rather than people. And looking then to academic justice, we need academic mitigation at every institution where it's needed. No student should be suffering academically because of no fault of their own. We know that things like digital poverty are disproportionately impacting working class students, Black and brown students, those in overcrowded households, those with caring responsibilities. Why should students who are at the margins, students who find themselves disproportionately impacted be hit the hardest because of a failure to mitigate for those students? And we say academic mitigation in the broadest sense of the word. We want to be seeing support for students, automatic extensions for PGRs and so on. We really need to see this in a whole holistic way. We also want to see that unsafe exams stay cancelled. FE students have been pushed from pillar to post. There's been, massive gaps between what A-level students have been told, what BTEC students have been told, what students on doing vocational qualifications have been told, and this isn't right. We need to make sure that when students have been told their exams are cancelled, they're not going to turn around and insert, informative exams. That's not fair. We need justice across all of those forms of assessment to make sure that in the here and now, those exams stay cancelled, but that we see this as a pathway to re-envision assessment across FE. And we also need to see an end to digital poverty. We can't go on with a system where broadband is such a fundamental part of our infrastructure, such a fundamental part of our access to learning. And yet there's still so much disparity in who can access what. We need to make sure that no student is left behind as we see the digital space becoming more and more crucial in access to education. So that's why we're hosting the digital rally. I'm so excited to come together with you. We've got some amazing speakers, from MPs to students across the global student movement, to students organising locally here in the UK. I'm gutted that we can't be in person out on the streets yet, but of course, having a digital conference, it makes sense to have a digital rally. And this is just one pillar in the multiple things that we're coming together to achieve, coming together to amass our collective voice with. Because there's also political power that we're building. Right now, we've got elections coming up in a couple of the nations, so Wales and Scotland. Better believe there's going to be strong student voter registration. And if you haven't registered for your vote, but for your postal vote, for your proxy vote ahead of the upcoming deadline, please make sure you do that. Because it's only through these dual forms of power, through making sure that we've got that power on the ground in every region, in every nation, that we have a strong voice, but that we also have that strong political power, that we can fuse those things together to deliver, to win now, but also to win our broader aims that grasp at the root of the issues that we're facing, through our campaigns that seek to mobilize students to build a new vision for education and to decolonize education. So from the ballot box to eventually the streets, but to now for the Zoom room, we are seeking to build that power together. I come back to the statement that a union is only as powerful as the sum of its members. Because to win and to fundamentally build a new education system and a new world from the rubble as the old, we need strength in every region, in every nation. We need to collectively build that over the next year and into the future. So as I close, it is my joy and privilege to declare NUS National Conference 2021 officially open. I look forward to learning from you and growing with you over the next 3 days. And I can't wait to organise with you beyond this space to build a grassroots mass movement capable of realising a new vision for democratised, decolonised education. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm really looking forward to inviting two folks who have themselves been involved in the student movement in some way, form or shape. And who are now out in the world doing amazing things. And before I jump into that, I just want to say thank you so much for all the love in the chat. I really do appreciate it. And yes, and now I'm going to jump us straight into hearing from a couple of speakers who are here to join us for the opening plenary. So without further ado, we have with us Shante Joseph, who is a social media creative, host and writer. She hosts How to Not Be Racist on Channel 4 and Anything Goes with Ai Weiwei. She's written for publications such as British Vogue, The Independent, The Guardian, Vice, Soho House, Complex UK, Galdem, Refinery 29 and Bustle. So excited to have Shante with us. And we've also have with us Suhaima Manzoor Khan. Suhaima is an educator, writer and poet from Leeds, West Yorkshire. Her work disrupts understandings of history, race, knowledge and power, interrogating the political purpose of narratives about Muslims, migrants, gender and violence. Suhaima was the runner-up of the Roundhouse National Slam 2017 with her viral poem, This Is Not a Humanizing Poem, which gained 2 million views and was shortlisted for the Outspoken Prize for Poetry in 2018. So I am really excited to explore with these speakers, to explore with these guests who I'm very looking forward to chatting with. The fact that there are, some really fundamental things around students having their voices heard in this moment. And so without further ado, I think I'll hand it over first to Shante.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of a technology crisis.
No worries at all. Are you with us?
Yes, I'm so sorry. Bloody hell, this is so stressful. You'd think the amount of Zooms that I've done, I'd be able to just get my things together, but unfortunately, it's a bit chaotic.
It's been a struggle. The past year has been a struggle, so no worries at all. Thank you so much for joining us. Are you all good?
Yes.
Wonderful. I'll hand over.
Well, could you repeat the last thing you said? Because it was
Yes,
just...
I'm so sorry. So just to lead us in again, I think really looking for your kind of first reflections to kick us off on, you know, what the fundamental things are around students having their voices heard in this moment. You know, obviously you, I'm sure you'll speak to kind of your experience as an officer at Bristol and kind of those campaigns that you ran and things that you did, and the way that you worked there, and all the way through to where you are now. What do you think are some of the reflections that you have on, or your advice for students in having their voices heard in this moment and beyond?
I honestly think, especially at this time, being vocal and being brave and being bold, I think it sounds really dramatic, but literally change your life forever. I think it's literally in these kind of moments of crisis, being confident enough to say, actually, I'm going to speak up against this, or actually, this doesn't feel right. And I want to use the resources and the communities that I have available to me to organize and do great work, can not only change your life, but change lives of people around you. I think, yeah, my kind of experiences as an officer were like, it was very mixed. I think I definitely did struggle in the sense that I wanted freedom. I wanted to do what I want. I didn't like bureaucracy. I didn't like layers. I wasn't really kind of familiar with all of that stuff. And so in some respects, I definitely did struggle. But if anything, it kind of just taught me how you work within larger structures, what it means to really get people on your side and to gain their support, and to get people enthusiastic about working with you and creating things that, you know, you feel like you need to change. And so in that respect, like, yeah, it's really good. And I definitely would encourage people to really get active. And being active doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a position. I think that is something that maybe gets drilled into you a lot as a student, like you need to be the leader of this or the representative of this, but actually you really don't. And I think sometimes being able to just be kind of independent and work within structures and support the people already doing the work, or find ways to support and help the people that are closest to you, can be equally as impactful and rewarding. And so I think, yeah, one thing I probably did get wrapped up in a lot is this whole idea of like labels, or feeling like in order for me to do the work or empowered to do the work, I had to have a title that said I could. But actually, no, I didn't. I could have done everything I did before and worked within other structures or under other people, or done it independently. So that's kind of like my initial feelings and thoughts on kind of just organizing and my experience of organizing. And I know to people who are probably here who are like thinking of running for things, or if they don't win something, like honestly, continue as you are, because you will still do incredible work and your contributions are always valued.
My good sis always comes with the gems, because that is absolutely my take on it as well. I think there's so much power in just coming from where you are and seeing that as experience and as commendation enough. You know, that's the background I came from in terms of just organizing and knowing that that's enough. And yeah, so big agree on that one. And so Haima, thank you so much for being with us. Do you want to jump into some of your kind of opening thoughts about that same kind of question, I guess, around the fundamentals for students to have their voices heard?
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much for having me here. Good morning, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. I just wanted to say first off, like, thanks for the amazing opening speech, Larissa. I'm ready to become a student again and join the movement. And I was like, let me go back to uni just to join in. But no, I was thinking about the you know, what to talk about today, or what I thought was a really important thing to mention. And I think I always come back to, you know, similar themes at the end of the day. And I think that quote from Audre Lorde, that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, is so important. And particularly for you guys who are in the student movement, your role may be to represent the needs of students. And obviously you're all, from that amazing video that we saw, you're all doing amazing work at that. But I think at the same time, we have to remember that there is no interest of students that is not also, you know, an interest that is a social, economic, political, global interest at the same time. And so I think always knowing in the work that we're doing that there is no way to improve students' lives without fundamentally improving everybody's lives. And I think that's helpful, that's important. Because I think there can be there's a risk. There's potentially two ways of seeing, you know, the issues that students face, right? So you could see them as particular issues that students are being forced off campus, or, you know, having to cover rents whilst leaving jobs, or, you know, there being a lack of care, digital poverty, all the things that have been mentioned. but we could also see these as general issues, right? We can see these as issues of capitalism, right? For the fact that capitalism exploits labor, that people are forced to pay rent on properties that they do not own, that they're not able to own, that people do not have the care that they need. You know, the mental health issues students are facing are only compounded by the general issues that, you know, we face, not being able to access mental health services, but also we know the racial disparities mental health services have. We know prevent being a public duty on mental health providers, you know, kind of disproportionately affects Muslims trying to access mental health services. So there's all of that. And I think just remembering that there are none of these issues are single issues is important, because it can kind of feed into the demands that we then make. But also it reminds us that, you know, we're not here to try to access the system. We're here to try to change, disrupt, and kind of, you know, throw that system into frenzy, I suppose, to leave it questioning itself. And I found a quote recently from Ambalavena Sivanandan, and it's from an amazing speech that he has, which he has many of. But I just wanted to read this quote, which was that in fighting our specific causes, we need also to be aware of the common cause they spring from and address ourselves to both at once, and so forge the alliances we need to win the battle. And I think that sometimes can feel tricky to do both, to have both in mind at the same time, the specific cause and the common cause. But ultimately, you know, that's why I think the student movement has always been so successful, is because oftentimes you're able to see that, you know, people don't just come to university and kind of, you know, face a million new issues that didn't exist before. The issues that people face at university are the issues that are compounded by, you know, all the disparities that exist. So the only advice that I can share, I mean, you guys are already all organizers, it's just that making sure that our demands do, as Larissa has said, really grasp the roots of things, making sure that our demands also come from the people, right? I think it can be easy to kind of have these theoretical ideas of what we want, and think, and kind of actually what Shante was saying, that, like, you know, think that you kind of need a role or position or a label to be doing something. But when we're just listening to each other, when we're just having those everyday mundane conversations, a lot of the important information about the demands we need to make comes from there. And if we overlook those everyday conversations as just like, oh, you know, this is just chit chat, you know, this doesn't affect our lives, I think we miss really important connections. So that's one thing. And the other thing is remembering that our goals can be strategic without being limited. I'm just thinking obviously about the conversations about abolition over the last year, that the idea of defunding the police as an example is the idea of not having a limited goal, right? Abolition is the ultimate goal, but having strategic demands along the way can help us to get there without becoming kind of reformist and without kind of just saying that we want to placate the system. And I suppose that's the final point, is to remember that the university, as everybody has already said, is a neoliberal institution, and that being the case, it can't be reformed, it can't be redeemed. And I think we have to fully embrace that and know that where we're headed is a different education system concept altogether, a different idea of learning, a different idea of what it means to share ideas, a different way of being. And as many great thinkers have said over time, you know, that means we also will have to change. We also will have to let go of the attachments we form to the university, even as we try to work for students, let go of our status as students, even as we're trying to make demands as students. And so I think we can embrace that excitement that comes with that, and be willing and ready. I think there's kind of a humility, I suppose, that is required to be open to changing as much as we want to change the things around us. So that's all I had to say as my opening thoughts.
I loved that. And I think what you were saying there about, like, the university cannot be redeemed. I think in lots of groups with students, we've been talking about, what does the abolition of the university mean? What would it mean to build anew? And really, like, as you're saying, like, forge that new vision, not just for education, but situated within the wider world. And so yeah, really, really great for your remarks there, and you touched on, you know, the prevent duty and how that's disproportionately impacting access to mental health, and of course a number of other elements of access to education. You talked about financial injustice and a lot of things, but I guess just your reflections there on for both of you, it'd be great to hear what you think are some of the biggest challenges that we're facing through the pandemic, but also more broadly. So yeah, Shante, I don't know if you want to kick us off in response to that one.
Yeah, I definitely think one of the biggest things, I mean, this will affect students, but I think it will probably affect, like, just recent graduates in general, people who are leaving education and entering work for the first time, the complete lack of employment that people have access to. One of the things that I've kind of written about recently is the fact that there is kind of like adulthood has been stunted for a lot of young people, because like the kind of cultural markers that we see as you becoming an adult are essentially no longer in access to us, basically. Like this whole thing of like, you know, buying a house or starting a family and whatnot, like all of those markers have been moved because they're so tied to economies. They're so tied to how much you earn and how much you have access to and disposable income and whatnot. And as people have less and less money, they're less likely to then achieve the things that help them feel like they are kind of growing up. And I think that kind of stunting of adulthood is a huge issue for a lot of people. And even people experiencing that, it is very, very different depending on who you are. So some of the people I spoke to were, you know, people who had autism and ADHD, and they work really, really hard on being able to communicate and speak to people confidently. But then being in a pandemic and being locked down and being isolated means that they then find it very, very difficult to do that. And so a lot of people are saying they feel like they've regressed to a teenage version of themselves because they no longer have the skills and ability to talk to people in a way that, you know, someone should for their age. And I think for me anyway, researching that piece and talking to people for that piece was, yeah, it was quite heartbreaking, because a lot of people are feeling very dissatisfied, and it's because of these things that are completely outside of their control. They don't set the standards for what it means to being an independent adult, yet they are failing to achieve it and then feeling really bad about it, and it's affecting their mental health in so many ways. There was someone I spoke to who lived in Cork, and she is trans, but she's not actually out to her family, and she was supposed to move to London to do all of her transition surgery, and she literally cannot do that, so she's stuck at home feeling like she cannot even be herself, cannot even progress as an individual or grow up, because she can't go anywhere. And of course, there are several huge issues, but I think just something that I have kind of noticed through speaking to people, through writing, is this whole idea of like, you not really being able to move on with your own life because you just cannot move forward. People were really worried about then kind of competing with a whole new generation of graduates who would be leaving education like shortly after them, and they have struggled to find work, and then the people after them will struggle to find work, and then what does that mean for kind of labor overall? What does it mean for people who are vying hard for graduate schemes where they're paying people absolute pennies, and they can now just be justified in doing that because there is so much labor that is available? And so yeah, I think that is just another huge issue as well. And then on top of that, everything that we've seen with the sentencing bill, everything that we've seen with the protests that are happening, this whole kind of clamping down on rights, on freedoms of expressions, and what that means for people who are already the most marginalized, and the kind of the discussions that we're having, as you've mentioned before, about policing and what that means for people as well, with all of these kind of laws being ushered in kind of under the guise of, you know, protecting people against spreading coronavirus, then just being used to, you know, further entrench the police state in our lives. So there's just so much that is like happening, and there's a lot, but I think maybe on a personal level, on a human level, one thing that I think for me really stands out is the mental health issues, and the fact that people are just really struggling to just be on top of everything else that is happening in their lives. So yeah.
No, definitely. And of course, all of those things are interlinked as well, because we see the kind of the impacts of those material constraints that you were talking about there, and you know, the financial injustice that people are feeling, the fact that, you know, so many of those markers of adulthood that are linked to finance have been made impossible through, you know, years of austerity and through systems and structures that weren't built for us, and particularly for those at the margins, then contributing so directly to poor mental health. So no, I think that you're so right in that, like, these are so many of the things that not only cut across students, but cut across the broader world, and they're all so caught up in one another. So Hama, I don't know if you have any other reflections on things that are real priorities or the biggest challenges in this moment. And yeah,
I mean, I think there's so much, like Shante said, to potentially talk about, but I think one thing that's really obvious to say is just, you know, the big thing on people's mind this year has been physical ill health and mental ill health. And I think the primacy of health in our lives has really, for me anyway, sort of highlighted the fact that, you know, for chronically ill people and disabled people, these are not new issues, right? Like the idea about like how you can access space safely, how you can kind of attend lectures safely, how you can kind of be in the world safely and in a way that your well-being is kind of cared for, has been something that's not a new issue, and yet it's something that we're kind of like a lot of people are kind of recently thinking about. And I think that that's interesting to me because a lot of the solutions that we're seeing are supposed to be quite short-termist and quite like how we're going to fill this gap right now, which does, I suppose, make me worried that, you know, a year from now, or 2 years from now, or whatever, we just go back to the way that things were for lots of people who already remained excluded from a lot of things. So I think that's something just to think about in terms of when we're thinking about the issues that people have faced, also thinking about how this just amplifies issues that other people have faced for a long time. And obviously, you know, the ironies of there being no institutional racism and knowing that like Black and brown people have died disproportionately in this pandemic, and thinking about how are we going to strategically kind of, you know, address these issues that are simultaneously being completely denied from the get-go. There's not even a conversation to be had. So yeah, because I think there's something powerful as well about just thinking about if we named the issues that we're facing right now. I mean, arguably there's been a genocidal logic to this, the way that this pandemic has been dealt with, and it has led to disproportionate deaths of chronically ill, disabled, and people of color. And I think if we talk about that as just sort of, you know, the way that the numbers have become, right, just this kind of like, oh, there's this many people died today, I think there's a certain numbness that deliberately comes with that. I don't think it is just sort of accidental. I think it's a deliberate depoliticization of those deaths. And so I think actually the centrality of death in this last year, you know, as sort of morbid and horrible and full of grief as it has been for many of us, I think should also remind us that, you know, there's just the physical, very basic ability to breathe, to live, to just like go safely through the world is something that is a hugely political issue. And there's so many kind of things that we can, I don't know, if we took that as a center for thinking, there's so many ways that it connects to other things. So yeah, and that's sort of my reflection, but I think there's just so many ways you can go with that. So I don't really have one, you know, thing that we could do, but thinking about that as a start point seems helpful.
Definitely helpful. And I think what you were saying there about folks who have always been excluded and not wanting to regress. Like I know that folks within the Disabled Students Caucus have been talking over the past few weeks. We've recently had our Liberation Conference about the fact that so many things that disabled student campaigners were calling for years, even for decades in some cases, were told that they were consistently told they were impossible, they couldn't be done, no way, not going to happen. And then as soon as the virus hit, they were done. And I think it's been really infuriating to see, you know, over so long, these things, these calls for justice were delegitimized. And now suddenly, because they affect different sets of people, and, you know, sets of people with power, then suddenly they're an issue. But yeah, no, I think both those reflections were, I think, really helpful to kind of navigate what is a really overwhelming terrain of issues and try and find those clinch points and biggest challenges there. So kind of moving on to think about campaigning a little bit more, what would you say are the fundamentals for really impactful campaigning? Are there any examples of like organizations that you think are doing it really well at the moment that we can point folks towards? And yeah, just your reflections there on campaigning. I feel like I might switch around the order. I feel like Shantae, I'm always asking you to go first, and I hate it when I'm on a panel and they're like, yeah, you again. So yeah, no. So Haima, do you want to jump in?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, yeah. I think obviously what Sisters Uncut have been doing over the last month or so is such a good example of successful campaigning. So for anybody who's not been following it, the police and crime sentencing bill that Shantae already mentioned, and the kind of repression of protest that is being made possible or hoping to be made possible by the government, has been so well, I think, not only so you're asking what makes a good campaign. I think if you look at what Sisters Uncut have done, they've had a really clear sense of their demands, right? We don't want this bill. We do not want this bill to pass. This bill is not okay to pass. But they've also I think had really strong messaging in the sense that this isn't just about this bill, this is about police in general. So their messaging around that bill and around their campaigning is that, you know, police don't make women safe, and they have, you know, they have all the statistics and all the kind of breakdown of that and their research and all the kind of evidence. But I think the way that they've framed that means that if you're somebody who's maybe new to the topic, or you're just kind of like unaware of this bill, you can see that, look, this bill is bad, but actually so is the entire structure. And that's, I think that's a really good kind of element to any campaign, is have your strategic goal, but show us what the issue is. And I think the other thing is that they've had these really strong direct actions, right, where you have media presence. So they've had these vigils, which I'm sure loads of you've seen, and then, you know, the media attention that that's got, also because of police violence, which is kind of, you know, what I suppose you could expect. But I think that's been really good, because you get the national kind of media side of it with your strong sense of your demands, and I think those two things together work really well. Whereas if you only have one and not the other, I think that can undermine. So if you get the kind of national media bit, but you don't know what exactly it is you want, I think that can undermine some campaigns. So yeah, I think that's a good example right now. I was thinking about them because, you know, they were successful, right? The bill has been halted for now, at least, and that's, you know, now there's time for people to mobilize, to make that a bigger movement, to kind of make it more and more difficult for the government. So yeah, I think to me that's an example of really good work that I've seen recently.
Yeah, definitely a strong example. And I love how you kind of pulled out the elements of that made it so successful, because I don't think I necessarily, I don't know, in my head pulled out like that, how that had converged to build a campaign that was really, really impactful. So no, thank you for that. Shantae, I know you mentioned before the work around the bill. So I don't know if you agree that that's like a really great example, if you have another that you'd point towards.
Yeah, I would literally say exactly the same thing. Like, I think everything they did was amazing. Like, and I think just like watching it and seeing it unfold online and seeing it unfold on TV and kind of seeing the way it was really weird. I guess like they did so much incredible work, even in terms of like disseminating information and getting people to understand, like, you know, this is why the police are not a good thing. And having that conversation, had it in a way that was so accessible and it didn't feel isolating. And I think they did a great job. And it then allowed a lot of people to then kind of not poke holes, but see the way that I can't remember what the White Girls campaign was, but to see the way that the language they were using and the things that they were saying weren't actually conducive for the change that needed to be made. And so I think, yeah, when you can educate people really well, that they can then see where the issues lie for themselves, I think that's really great. And then I guess one thing I would even add, even though I don't necessarily think it's like a campaign, but thinking about the work that places like Galdem and Huck magazine were doing, especially when it came to being present at a lot of these protests, like getting all of the footage, working with the activist groups to write articles that made things really, really clear and give a really fair and coherent viewpoint on what was going on, I think was really, really, really effective. And then how that translated to social media. Like, I know infographics are like sometimes the worst things in the world, but even just creating things, teaching people, you know, this is what you do if you get arrested, this is what you do when you're at a certain protest, and if this happens and whatnot, and then basically allowing people to have access to the information so they're safe when they do go to the streets, I think was like so good.
Big agree. And like even seeing things like the GBC, the Green and Black Cross, putting out those kind of how to safely protest and so on. So yeah, I know that, across the student movement, we often dunk on the Instagram infographic industrial complex, but it also has so much utility in these moments. So trying to find the ways that it can have use for our movement and kind of extracting that while recognizing, sometimes some of the takes are tired.
It can be really, really effective and really informative. Like, especially I think during Black Lives Matter, when a lot of people were kind of talking about and understanding abolition for the first time. I remember like Black abolitionists, it was like an Instagram page, were basically sharing just so much really useful information, but then telling people, look, we run a reading group that we do every single week. We have a reading group that's specifically for Black people. We have a reading group that's specifically for trans people, where we talk about how abolition affects their respective communities and stuff like that. I was like, this is banging. And it was just so accessible, like really inviting. And they obviously use social media to then draw people to content that was much more detailed. And I thought like that was a really, really good thing.
Yeah, I think it's that. It's about using those platforms as a pathway to broader political education, right? That's such a great point. And I think also the way that you were talking about like the role of Huck, the role of Galdem, you know, seeing the role of like different forms of campaigning in a kind of the broadest sense of the word, and like seeing the role of like movement lawyering and movement journalism and like all of these things, because of course like across the student movement we all have such different approaches to the work. And I think it's really, really useful to contextualize that for journalism and the way that captured what was happening, but also then to think about that kind of and extrapolate onto the different skill sets that people might have. So just a kind of reminder to folks that like, find your linchpin, like use the thing that you're angry about and the thing that, you know, sparks joy or like that you do best, and bring those together and don't feel like you have to campaign in one way. So yeah, I guess then thinking about, you know, we've talked about the policing bill, we've talked about Prevent, we've talked about some of those things that are trying to blockade activism and trying to blockade, you know, folks from speaking out. And of course, again, that falls on folks at the margins the hardest. So just it would be great to get your reflections on the risks attached to trying to put yourself and your campaigns and your work on the national agenda, because you're obviously both very visible. I was going to say quite visible. I was like, no, very visible. And I imagine that comes with quite a few risks. So how do you manage those? I don't know who wants to jump in first. Yeah, Sahaima?
Yeah, sorry, is that awkward Zoom etiquette or you're like, oh? Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I'd be lying if I said that there's like I have any semblance of an answer to it, but I think it is interesting to try and unpick it, because I guess in my head there's sort of there's two things going on, right? So there's the kind of the state deliberate kind of coercion of the speech and ideas of anybody who's trying to say anything that's kind of against the status quo. And I think, you know, we have to remember that, yes, of course, it has its most kind of visible head, I suppose, through Prevent and through kind of very obvious policing bills, but that also at the same time through counter-extremism, which is this very kind of nebulous and ambiguous strategy that has already seeped into, you know, your local youth club, your local gallery, your library. Like counter-extremism is so insidious at this stage, and you know, it's obviously it's racialized in the fact that we're going to attach that to Muslim bodies, but it's going to affect any type of thinking or ideas that young people in particular are having. And also it means that the kinds of ideas that you can formulate are being influenced by people who have been told that, you know, anti-capitalism is an extremist ideology, right? So what kind of ideas can you formulate as a young person? So saying that, I actually think that if you have visibility or if you have a role, you're a student officer, I think you have a responsibility to speak, because in a way you that actually acts as capital that protects you a tiny bit, at least in different ways, and I'll come to that in a second, but it protects you in the sense that, you know, you're not just, you know, somebody, well, I think there's a difference between somebody who's, you know, 16 years old, precarious financial and immigration status, and their school reports them to Prevent for an idea that they've had, right? And they don't have any visibility, they don't have any sense of, you know, people who won't necessarily speak out in their defense or whatever, as compared to us. And I think in that sense, we really have to use that visibility actually to make visible those structures. And on the other hand, the other thing I think about is obviously the way that lots of student officers throughout, you know, I suppose history have been smeared by national media, and you know, other people who activists have been smeared in you know, for different ways and for different reasons, and it's usually Black and brown Muslim activists. And I think when you're thinking about how to manage that, I would also just remind us that like the point isn't to manage, you know, the ways that we're perceived, because actually it's a good thing, you know, in an ironic way, it's a good thing, right? You're doing the right thing if national right-wing media outlets are not happy with what you're doing. But all I would say is that when we think about managing, I think what we need to think about is, are we building strong enough communities of care where we actually have people to fall back on and people who will kind of, yeah, take responsibility for each other? Because I think sometimes in the kind of individualistic anti-racism work or kind of liberation work that can build, it can that can be very counterintuitive for the kind of futures we want to build, but also it can create this sense of isolation that then means when these things happen, you know, we don't actually have that sense of care and that kind of focus on well-being. And so if you then are smeared in the media, that can be absolutely debilitating. And it can also kind of have that, it can have that deterrent effect basically on other people. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think that the ways to manage are really about the ways that we're building our own really caring and strong foundations, because then no matter what kind of happens, whether it's the state or the media or combination, we have a way of resisting the harms of that ourselves, I think.
Yeah, that was such a great kind of point about collective care as opposed to like diluting yourself. And I think that's such an important message. Shantae, I don't know if you have reflections on that, on how you kind of navigate it.
Boy, do I have reflections on this. Wow. Do you know what? Yeah, I would definitely say like media attention did blight a lot of my student activism experience, and in ways definitely forced me to be more silent. Like I say more silent because I definitely don't think I am silent on social media, and I will say whatever, and I will go back and forth with trolls, and I will be like, your mom, don't ever chat to me like do you know what I mean? Like I very much do not care, but it can be awful. Like it can be absolutely awful. It's just, I remember the first time I ended up in, like, the Sun wrote an article about me because I called out something being racist in Bristol or whatever, and like the amount of like kind of just hate and just it was horrible. Like I was even scared to leave my own like accommodation because it was petrifying to see the things that people were saying to me and sending to me and threatening me with, and yeah, it was hard. And I think at the time I was really, really lucky. I don't know if Sam is still here, but like Sam, all my days, was like such an angel when I was at Bristol, just like constantly just checking in on me, making sure I was okay, because it was hard. Like I was broken down a lot. And I think, yes, I definitely feel like much more resilient and I can handle it now. And as my platform's grown, I've been able to really just let this stuff be water off a duck's back. But my word, it was probably one of the worst things I've ever been through in my life, to have that sort of negative attention and have all of that. Yeah, it was hard. And I think, yeah, the way you do solve it is by having communities and support systems and places and groups that of people who will back you no matter what. And I remember, like, you know, and there were like 3 times where, you know, these right-wing publications would go to Bristol SU and be like, oh, this student said this, like, what's your comment on it? And they'd be like, you know, what's the issue? And I think things like that, for me, it was so reassuring, and it made me want to continue doing the work I was doing, because I knew that, you know, even if the Sun and the Daily Express and all of these places wanted to write scathing articles about me, I knew that my students' union would still have my back, because I never said anything that was outrageous, and I never said anything, you know, that warranted the level of abuse that I was receiving. And yeah, and I do think, yeah, I agree. Like, if you do have a platform, then you definitely do have a responsibility to promote those messages and talk about these issues that other people may feel more apprehensive about because they have more to lose than you do. And it's something that I do a lot. And I don't even really tweet that much, but I definitely retweet and share anything. Someone tags me and, Shantae, can you share this thing? Be it a fundraiser, be it a campaign, be it just information they need to get out there. I'm like, sure thing. Do you know what I mean? Because I have this platform for a reason. So I might as well do the most I can to make sure that I'm sharing stuff in a way that is authentic and gets people the reach that they want it to get. But yeah, I definitely do feel like, especially during everything that happened during the Black Lives Matter with Meghan Markle and everything with the kind of the Kill the Bill process that have been happening, I have noticed that the abuse has been like tenfold. Like, I am getting it really, really, really bad. And I am definitely starting to get a bit worried, because I think I feel like things are becoming very, very intense. And I think maybe before, where I would say whatever, like, defund the police, abolish the police are dry, what are we doing, blah, 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 and it wouldn't be that bad. Now people are like really going out of their way to try and attack me about this. And there's something about this moment that just feels very different and very hostile. So I would definitely say to people, you know, just be careful. and know, like, understand the beast that you're dealing with. And a lot of the time, particularly online, these bots or these individuals even are very organized. And I sometimes think that we think they're just like, you know, Barry 1976 England flag is some random guy wherever, but these people are part of like coordinated groups. And I remember when my series with Channel 4 came out, How Not to Be Racist, bear in mind it's satire, it's very funny. It's like, yes, we're talking about serious issues, but like I like to write kind of comedy, so it was very just kind of lighthearted, but also, you know, still packed a punch. And within like seconds of the video being uploaded onto YouTube, it would have 1,000 dislikes. And even now, I think all of the videos have more dislikes than they do likes, and all of the comments are just people like ripping into me. And when I say they did this stuff with a quickness, like, people are so organized, especially those right-wing trolls. Like, they will do everything they can to basically get your content removed and get you removed off platforms, and they do it in a very smart way. And so I would just say, yeah, be very careful. If you're online, check the lists that people have added you onto on Twitter, because I would tweet something and within seconds someone would be like, go back to your country. And I'm like, how did you even find me so fast? First of all. Second of all, I'm tweeting about getting my ears pierced. So what has this got to do with anything? And it's because I'm on lists that people have made where they just constantly check these lists to see, you know, if people they don't like are tweeting. And then they're like, yeah, go to hell. And it is very strange. And they are also using technology and social media in ways to harass you even more. But yeah, like, obviously speak out if you can, but just read the room a bit. And I'm kind of like, now that I'm seeing what is happening and I'm seeing the amount of kind of hate, and there are police officers with Twitter accounts and they think that they're so like, oh, they can hide it. But like, you know, when a Fed is behind an account and they are like harassing you. And I think that stuff is very scary as well. So yeah, be careful, but also don't feel like you can't say anything, and make sure you lean into the communities that you have around you. But I honestly don't kind of blame some people who completely just come offline, because it can be quite petrifying. And I think definitely over the past couple of months, I've become a lot more paranoid, just because how intense and how terrible things have been at the moment.
Well, sending masses of solidarity to you both, for what I can imagine is really difficult to navigate. And there's actually a question here, Shante, from one of your successors as BAME network officer at Bristol, who's talking about how you navigate kind of the balance between being involved in these movements and speaking out, but also protecting your well-being. And I think you've almost answered the question without seeing it, I think. So, you know, that was a kind of I think a perfect response to knowing how to read the room, as you said, and be responsive to that. So thank you so much for answering a question that you didn't even know. I guess there's just looking at some of the other stuff coming in from folks who have joined to listen to your words of wisdom. There's been a question to Suhaima around I think this is Khadija again, who said that they love how you've reminded us of the importance of disrupting the system, and many students, especially those from minority groups, are disproportionately impacted by international issues, even while in the UK. The recent Islamophobia from the French Senate, for example, has distressed many, and a lack of ability to change situations outside our own country can feel stifling. So how you would recommend to students to directly take action to feel empowered to make change on that international level?
Well, yeah, I think one thing, and then just taking this as the example, is solidarity. Obviously, it's number one. You know, you can extend solidarity, and I think because you guys are students anyway, reach out to students' unions in France, reach out to the student movements and civic organizations there, and remember actually that they're under even more coercion from the state there. You know, the state in November shut down like 15 of the top Muslim kind of civil rights organizations. So we actually maybe have a responsibility as well to amplify and shed light on those issues that are going on in France or wherever it is. And I think if you can reach out and make those connections, find out what it is that we can actually say that would be useful. That solidarity is not just saying like, you know, yeah, we can say we're in solidarity with you, that it hurts to see this happening there, but also what can we do? Is there any certain messages we can share, or any certain things like that, I think could be useful. And also, I think being really wary and thinking, okay, what were the steps taken for the state to be able to do that here? How do we preempt these things happening here, right? How do we already begin to mobilize against these things happening? And I think the fact that we do have a really strong, not just student movement, but different types of movements, I think, means we are in a kind of advantageous position for when these things happen. But remembering that it is, I think France, lots of things that have happened in France over the last year are, I think, we should really be taking as precursors for what is well on its way to happen here. And I think really just being wise about that, taking advice from the French organizers and movement builders. But yeah, I think maybe just starting off with literally those conversations, reach out to somebody at a university in France or a school and, how can we help, what's going on? I think that can be useful.
Thank you so much for that. And I think, I can see in the chat that that's really resonating with folks. I think something else that really resonated was the conversation, or the part of the conversation around the fact that, the trolls and those who are against us, but also, on an individual level, but also those who are organised in that way, as well as the systems themselves, are so kind of well prepared in upholding power. And so a question from Axel around how communities like ours become as organised as these systems that already exist, which is no small question. But I don't know if either of you want to jump in. Shante, you're off mute already, so I might just put you on the spot.
I always forget to mute myself again. I don't know why, but yeah, God, that's a really hard question. I think it's difficult because I guess you can't really organize exactly the same way that they organize, simply because I guess the resources and the things and the structures they have available to them already lean to their preference for what the world should be like. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's like, how do you do something in a way that is different but still has solidarity and is still effective? And I think one of the things that I guess people do talk about a lot that is quite hard is like when we talk about things like class solidarity, but we talk about the ways that kind of race is used as a tool to essentially separate people from organizing with each other by creating these divisions on something that doesn't really even exist, and how that makes it so hard for you to then work with people to actually change things. And I guess, yeah, a lot of it is probably just about trying to find ways to reach out to people who also want to create a version of the world that suits and best fits most people, and find ways for you to organize that best fits your community, basically, because not everything is going to work for everyone. And I think the more localized we become, the easier it becomes to then make change. But I think, yeah, on the right, when it comes to these trolls, like these people are organized, and they're also very protected, because the same people who are kind of sending hate and abuse, they're also police officers. So they're people who are, allegedly there to protect and serve, but they're still sending, or they're still condoning abuse. Do you know what I mean? Like, police officers have been called out for racism, sexism, homophobia. They've just let it fester inside this organization. And it's like that in every institution in the UK. So sometimes I think we can't really beat ourselves up for not seeming as organized as they are, when they have whole societies that are built up to support them and keep things as they are. Like, the police are racist, the police are trolls. And so we can only do what we can with what we have. But it is really hard, and it does sometimes feel quite disheartening, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be like this.
Can I just jump on that as well? Sorry, Larissa. I think that's such good advice, Shante. And I think also, remembering that it's deliberate, like the feeling of despair that it can leave us with, I think is really deliberate. Like, the idea that we can't imagine ways to live beyond this, or how we could ever possibly overcome this, is a very, very good antidote to any kind of change or transformation. And also, just because I can see it kind of kicking off in the chat as an ongoing thing, just to remind us that, things like right-wing media, they're not democratic institutions. They're owned by billionaires who make profit from their businesses. And I think we have to remember as well to, like, we shouldn't have democratic expectations of non-democratic institutions. So it's not like, oh, how, why is the media like this? How can we improve the media? Just don't buy it. It's actually a fact that the same people who own the material capital also own the means of communication that the majority of people are exposed to. And that's not an accidental thing. It's very deliberate. And as Shante said, it's the same people who, are part of these networks who are putting out these social media messages. the government itself in the Home Office have something called the Research, Information and Communications Unit, RICU. This is a really secretive unit, and it's essentially a propaganda unit. So they make these fake social media accounts, they make these fake, kind of campaigns and all this kind of messaging, they call it counter messaging. So it's not just that they're, I think it's realizing that, okay, why is there such a concerted effort by the state and by vested interests to, attack individual people? One, why would they be that interested in doing that? And I think if we can begin to realize the reason is because one powerful voice is actually really threatening. That actually reframes everything, because it then reminds you actually that, we're the ones with the power, and they're terrified. They're so afraid that they have to invest all these resources. They have to literally have a global industry running just to tell people to stay quiet. And I think that's quite empowering to remember that, wow, they're terrified. And if we could just kind of push and keep that going, I think we'd be really onto something. So just remembering that we have the power, we have the numerical power, we have the ideological power. All they have is control of the means of production and communication. And we can easily take that back, easily.
Can I even just add really quickly, because that just made me think about, like, when we think about the Black Power movement in the UK, and we think about the Black British Panthers and how tiny they were as a group, like numbers wise, they were very small. But boy, oh boy, did they feel the full force of the state. Like when you think of the special desk that they had set up to investigate the Black Power movement, and how much details they collected on them, and how they would drag them into court, and how they have so much information on them. They even knew about the essays they were writing in university. That is how much they surveilled them. And this was way before social media. And so it is like, anytime there is some sort of like brewing uprising, or there is some sort of thing that seeks to disrupt the state, they go ham and they go hard, and they ruined people's lives. And everyone watched Small Axe, and we saw Mangrove, and we were all like so emotional, and we were like, this is incredible. But after they won essentially their battle for Mangrove, they were harassed by the police constantly. So many of them moved back to the Caribbean, because you think you could go up against the state and win, and the rest of your life is fine. And that had huge effects for them. Their children suffered the effects of it. And even speaking to some of the children of the Mangrove 9, they fear that, their way of parenting, or the trauma that they inherited from their parents having their lives decimated by the British state, is affecting their parenting. And that's like that generational trauma. So it's like, if this small group of people can seem to be making some progress and have so much thrown at them that their children's children are feeling the effects of that, like it is a huge feat. And I think this British state has always been like this, and they've always done this, and they've always created a really horrible and hostile environment for people who dare to stand up against it, so much so people just leave the country because it's not worth them being here in the first place. So it's like, the things that we're dealing with they're not even new. And I think social media just gives it a new lens, but the British state been doing this. Do you know what I mean? It's how they operate, and it's petrifying, but I don't know, in a way, you're right. It feels like we are making progress when they feel like they have to do all of this work to try and silence us. Nowadays, everything's frozen for me.
Larissa's just disappeared.
Oh my God, it's the police. They can hear us.
I was just going to add then, since Larissa disappeared, I think what you said about this always having been the way, I mean, literally as well, just is actually factually true, isn't it? Like the British Empire built the tools of counterinsurgency that are the tools they use today. And, it was the US during the Black Power of the 70s and 80s, 60s and 70s. They were like, wow, do you know what? Colonial Britain has such great techniques of counterinsurgency policing, we're going to use those same techniques. That's where you get your policing raids from. That's where you get your assassinations from. That's where you get your, like propaganda campaign, misinformation campaigns from. And I think, like what you were saying about the Black Power movement is really interesting, because it's just like, they know that this is the way that you crush people, is they're attacking emotionally and mentally and psychologically and physically. So they, as much as they pretend these things don't matter, that is actually their technique. And so that, I think, is making me just think, so we actually do need to have those emotional and kind of psychological, sources of resilience and community, because if that's what they're attacking, how we're not going to be able to protect ourselves if they're coming for us like that. And yeah, it's just very, very wild.
It's weird how much they just kind of borrow from each other, because even when everything was kind of brewing in the UK, first they were like banning Stokely Carmichael from coming to speak in the UK because of his speech and how that sparked Black Power. And then when they saw all of the riots happening in the US, they then sent people from the UK to the US to kind of see, how do you quell these kind of movements? And then they kind of introduced loads of like funding pots where they were like, do you know what, we're going to give you all the money to do what you have to do, so you don't even have to be a part of this radical group anymore. And they just suck the life out of movements. And it's like, if they can't kill everyone or they can't throw everyone in jail, how else can we destabilize their movements? And they tried everything, because even when they were introducing all of the race relations acts and all of that stuff, all that did was then just persecute like Black Panthers. Like, it was literally the majority of people who went to jail under like, any sort of like race relations acts legislation were Black. And it's so wild that they thought, if we jail their leaders, then the movements will stop. If we try and kill their leaders, the movements will stop. And then they don't. And these movements are still existing today. So no matter how much they've tried to completely squash us, like, we're literally still here. And that is great, but it's also like, what next? Like, what are they going to pull out of the bag now? And I think we are seeing that with like the sentencing bill and all of that stuff. And it is interesting, I think, but also quite scary at the same time.
Yeah, I think particularly the thing about the way they try and co-opt movements, because I think that's harder to predict and it's harder to know that it's happening, because you're like, okay, yeah, clamping down, see that. But, like, I've had a couple of interactions in the last year where it's people who work in counter-extremism, they're working for the state, and the words they use to describe themselves is, so during Black Lives Matter protests in this summer, last summer now, I got an email from these two girls who work in counter-extremism in Europe, women, and they were saying, do you want to sign this open letter to kind of condemn the murder of George Floyd and ask for peace building measures in Minnesota? And I was just like, you are working in the security industrial complex, which is structured by racism, and you're asking me to sign this. But it was this whole thing of presenting a coercive policing technology as advocacy, as activism. And then that's how you co-opt people as well, because I think we have started to romanticize, we all want to be activists, we all want to be, just have these labels without kind of any necessary meaning to them. And they can co-opt that and say, okay, yeah, you want to be an activist, come work for the state. Yeah, come be an activist for the Home Office. Come deport people as an advocacy. It's like, we have to be really careful, because I think that is actually more insidious and a much cleverer way of just dividing our movements than necessarily outright policing. So yeah, I think you're right.
It is so weird as well, because even when we kind of like, when all the conversations about like abolition were happening, and I remember like, what's his name, like D-Ray or whatever, that the guy in the jacket or whatever, and he was part of that campaign about 8 ways to reform the police to blah 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 blah, but like, all reforms do really is sometimes even increase surveillance and increase police power. So it's like, and a lot of the reforms that he's promoting are things that have been done before. Like, you're just wrapping up like 2 years ago Christmas presents and giving it to people to be like, oh, look what I got you. Do you know what I mean? As if it's something new. And it's like, but because people, it's that whole thing you were saying earlier on about like, it's so difficult to imagine a world where these things literally don't exist, or imagine a world where we can, live happily without these structures that have continued to oppress us. Like, people just can't believe it. So it's so much easier to say, oh, if we just give them like cameras, then, it will stop this. But actually it doesn't. And all it does is increase surveillance, and they turn it off and they don't care. And it's like, but then all of that stuff becomes activism, because it's like, well, we're presenting an alternative, and any alternative to what we had now should be great, right? And you should be grateful for that. But actually that is not really the case, like, at all. And it's so weird. I remember getting really frustrated during that period, because I was learning a lot myself, and then seeing people constantly talk about like, reform this and do this and increase this law. And even everything that we saw when David Lammy was like, oh, after this Sarah Everard case, like, Labour, we're gonna increase life sentences for blah blah blah. Okay, but no one gets prosecuted. So what now? So you can make the sentences 1,000,001 years, but if no one's going to jail, who does that serve? And also, we know that there's no correlation between sentencing or prison numbers and crime going down. So that is obviously nothing at all. But the way people were clapping like seals, being like, yes, this is great stuff. And I'm like, it's like any alternative people think is a great thing. And it's like, but actually, no, it's not. Like, anyway, I'm rambling, but that was just, mad annoying. Like,
Not rambling at all. Honestly, one of my like pet peeves is like performative activism that isn't actually serving the communities that it says that it's serving. Like who are you operating for? Who are you accountable to? Like where is the rooting in the like the actual work? Do you know what I mean? What people have been saying for so long that they need. Yeah, no, it is infuriating. So not rambling at all. We always welcome a ramble over in the student movement. I am conscious of time. I'm also conscious that my Wi-Fi is tripping out. So I'm gonna come to you folks for some closing remarks. You've said so much, and I can see in the chat everyone is just like so thankful for your words, for your wisdom, for everything. But is there anything that in particular you want people to take away? Like, because people come here for National Conference once a year. It's where we come together to renew, to rejuvenate our energy. And is there anything that you'd want people to take away and head into the next year of their organising? Yeah, is there kind of any final reflections that you have out of all of this mass of really useful conversation?
I guess I would say a few things. One, don't make sort of like leaders out of individuals. I think one of the huge issues that we saw, particularly over the summer, was like people who had just never said anything about anything before suddenly kind of having one opinion about this and then being positioned as like an influence, or I was like an activist or a leader, and then them saying some crazy stuff and it just going left and basically undoing a lot of work that people have done. I think even on the left as well, there's sometimes like, you know, you may stand someone so much, like people love AOC so much and they're like, she's the queen, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, she can also be like problematic in some senses to people on the left as well. And I think there's, sometimes an issue of making leaders out of individuals. And another thing I wanted to say was like, honestly, like everyone who is kind of doing the work, campaigning for issues that support students, and we know that the issues that support students will therefore benefit the rest of society, like continue doing the work you're doing, continue being loud, continue being bold, continue working together. Like change is not inevitable. We can imagine a world that is different. Even when I think about how much like online, even like consciousness shifted during the summer, where people started talking about like abolition as opposed to reform, and how much of a huge jump that was, but it was very possible. And we're now seeing those same conversations being reaffirmed with everything that's happened over the past few weeks. Like things can change, people can change their minds. So continue the work you're doing and continue being brave. And it's hard because sometimes it feels like there are way more people who are against us than are for us, and it can make the whole experience of activism and campaigning really awful. But like lean into your communities and just keep doing the stuff that you're doing, because honestly, like you are the people who are changing the world and changing lives, and without you guys doing the work, this foundational work, like we won't be able to do much else in the future. So like, yeah, keep on going.
Yeah, I think if I can add anything, all I can add is, I would say on a more internal, introspective point, have a check-in with your own intentions. And I think do that regularly, because you know what, and I put my hands up for this, I think the more you gain of a social platform, the more you gain of a leadership role or any position, the easier it is to succumb to doing what will appear to be the right thing to do. And the easier it comes to kind of be like, you know, I want people to think I'm doing a good job. I want people to think that I have good politics. I want people to, you know, and that's all very natural. But how does that affect your intentions? How does that affect the reason you're doing what you're doing? And what Larissa said about who you're accountable to. And so I think having a regular check-in with like, what are my intentions? Why am I doing this work is really important. And with that, I would just say, don't be afraid to get things wrong. It's okay to get things wrong, and it's very natural. And actually the best people are not the people who don't get anything wrong. They're the people who, when they get things wrong, say, oh, wow, okay, yeah, I messed up. Like, I'm really sorry. Can we, you know, go again, right? I think I'm sure I speak for most people when I say, when you meet somebody who apologizes, it's 10 times better than meeting somebody who gets everything right. And so, yeah, I just think it's very tempting to kind of have the right opinion on everything in this day and age. But actually, what is more kind of sustainable is just to have that kind of humility, I suppose, is what it is, to say, I'm trying my best, but I might get it wrong. And if I do, that's fine. That's not a judgment on me as a person. If anything, if I can own up to it, you know, people will respect you more for it. So I would say, yeah, intentions and just kind of being human and being okay with being human. But yeah, you guys are doing the work, and I just wish you all the best with everything. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here this morning. So I hope the rest of the conference goes amazingly.
Yeah, that's facts.
Thank you so much. And if we're in person, there would be rapturous applause right now, because I can see it coming through in the chat. Some final words there, reminding us to be brave, to be humble, to be intentional, and just a huge thank you to you both, a huge sending of solidarity from the student movement to you, and just really, really grateful for your time, for your words, for your energy, and for everything that you do. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for helping us open conference.
Thank you to you too.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. I was so nervous as well, because I was like, oh my God, I don't know anything about anything. But so nice. So nice.
No reason to be nervous at all. You were brilliant. And yeah, just so grateful. Like, honestly, do you have the chat open? Because the way people are finding ways to thank you is absolutely wild. So yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
This is the awkward bit at the end of Zoom calls where you're just like, how do we close this? But I think I'm gonna hand back to someone in the team to let us know what's going on next. But thank you so much.
Thanks.
So I've just seen that pop up on the screen. So we've got a break now until our Energizer later at 1:30, which is an optional session, but we would love to have you. So please do take a break. Make sure you stretch your legs, hopefully get outside or something. Because yeah, obviously it's very different to have an online conference. So we want to make sure that, you know, in the spirit of collective care that we were just talking about, we have the space to refresh. I can see folks that are dropping links to things like Discords and stuff already to keep connecting over the break. So please do keep connecting with one another on socials and stuff. Please do keep connecting with me. I really love to hear from you. And the rest of the team, I'm sure, would say the same. So yes, just to answer the question in there, you can leave this chat and then we'll come back together at 1:30 for an optional Energizer, and then later on for the campaigning workshops. So thank you so much for your being here, making it this early in the morning, the day after a bank holiday. I'm very impressed that 400 of you made it. And for those of you who've been at a physical national conference before, you'll know that the morning session is often too early for some folks. But yeah, Easter chocolate is calling. I hear that, Alice. Let me go grab some chocolate. And just, thank you so much for the love in the chat. And yes, I look forward to seeing you all later on.